The sun was scorching, its relentless rays beating down on the cracked earth like a fiery hammer. The dry dust rose in puffs with every shift of wind, and the air was thick with the smell of scorched grass and parched soil. In this barren, desolate place, a German shepherd lay buried beneath the ground, her body trapped in a tomb of dirt, with only her head exposed. Her once glorious coat was matted with dirt, her fur sticking to her skin as if to cling to the faint memory of life. Her name was Kira, and she had trusted unconditionally. She had always given her love, her loyalty, and her heart to the man who had raised her. He had been her world, a kind, steady presence in her life. She had believed, with all the innocence of a dog, that he would never hurt her. But that trust was shattered in the most brutal way imaginable. The man who she had once followed loyally, the one who had promised to protect her, had turned on her. And now, as the hours stretched into days, Kira was trapped in the dirt, suffocating under the weight of her betrayal. She could barely move. Her body, weak and exhausted, struggled to find the strength to lift even her head. Her breathing was shallow, wheezing with every desperate gasp. Her dry tongue scraped against the parched roof of her mouth, and her sunken eyes stared out at the barren landscape, searching for anything at all, that could offer relief from the agonizing pain she was enduring. The sun beat down on her relentlessly during the day, drying out what little moisture remained in her body. Her fur was caked with dirt, and the cracks in the earth beneath her offered no comfort. She felt the weight of the ground pressing down on her chest, threatening to crush her with every breath. Every movement, every attempt to shift her position, sent waves of pain through her fragile body. Yet, despite the excruciating agony, Kira refused to give up. At night, the temperature plummeted, and the cold rain began to fall, drenching her fur, turning the dirt into mud. The rain brought no comfort, only a deeper chill. Kira's body trembled uncontrollably as the cold seeped into her bones, and the hunger and thirst gnawed at her from the inside. Each drop of water that fell felt like a cruel reminder of her suffering. Too much water, too little nourishment. The night felt endless, with only the sound of her labored breathing and the distant rumble of thunder. Through it all, Kira clung to the faintest thread of hope, a single stubborn belief that somehow, someone would come to rescue her. But the days stretched on, and with each passing hour, her strength grew weaker. The hope in her heart, once so bright, began to fade. She was ready to give in, ready to surrender to the cruel fate that had been thrust upon her. But then, just as her vision began to blur and her consciousness began to slip away, a sound pierced the silence. A voice. It was faint at first, barely a whisper in the wind. But it grew louder, more distinct, and Kira could hear footsteps, slow and steady, approaching her. Her heart skipped a beat, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, her ears twitched. Could it be? Could someone be coming for her? The footsteps grew closer, and Kira felt the ground shift as someone, began to dig around her, carefully, methodically, with a tenderness that contrasted sharply with the brutality of the way she had been buried. The dirt began to loosen around her, and the weight pressing on her chest slowly lifted. Kira tried to lift her head, to make some kind of sound, but her body was too weak. She could barely even move her lips. But the man or woman, whoever they were, did not stop. They continued to dig, their hands working with a sense of urgency, as if they knew time was running out for her. The moment of relief was bittersweet, filled with the hope that she had not been abandoned to die alone, but also with the pain of how long it had taken someone to find her. Finally, the last of the earth was cleared, and Kira felt herself being gently lifted from the ground. She could barely feel her limbs anymore, as if they no longer belonged to her. The air around her seemed to thicken, and her vision blurred as the world around her spun. The person who had found her spoke softly, their voice a mixture of terror, pity, and determination. Kira couldn't understand the words, but she could sense the urgency, the resolve. She felt herself being carried, her limp body cradled in strong arms. The pain of being moved was almost too much to bear, but she didn't resist. She couldn't. She could only let go, trusting in this stranger, this person who had come to save her when all seemed lost. As she was carried to safety, her mind began to slip into unconsciousness. But one thought remained clear. There was still a chance. There was still hope. The world around Kira was spinning in a haze. She was no longer aware of the harsh earth beneath her, nor the suffocating heat of the sun. All she could feel was the warmth of the person who had found her, their arms wrapped gently but firmly around her fragile form, and the sound of their steady breathing. The rhythmic thumping of their heart seemed to echo in her ears, and it was the only thing keeping her tethered to this world. The stranger who had found her. A man, she soon realized, his rough hands surprisingly tender as they cradled her. Moved quickly but with great care. His face was set in a grim expression, lips pressed tight as he rushed, but there was a softness in his eyes that Kira could sense even through her fading consciousness. The terror in those eyes mirrored her own desperation. Yet there was something else, something that kept him moving forward, something stronger than the fear. As he reached a small vehicle, Kira was gently laid down in the back seat. She couldn't feel her legs anymore, or anything below her chest for that matter. Her body had grown so numb from the hours of suffering that it felt like a foreign thing, completely disconnected from her mind. Her breathing, shallow and labored, was the only sign that she was still alive. The man slammed the door shut, and within moments, the vehicle roared to life. The hum of the engine vibrated through the air, adding to the overwhelming sensation of disorientation. Kira felt herself being moved again, the car jolting slightly as it sped down the road. There was no time for rest, no time for hesitation. He was heading straight for a place of help, a place where there was hope, where someone might be able to save her. The journey felt endless. Kira's head lolled to the side, her eyes fluttering open for brief moments, catching glimpses of the passing scenery, but nothing seemed real. It was as if she were floating in a world between life and death, hanging on by a thread, her senses distorted and failing. She could feel the tremors of her body, the tightness in her chest, the unbearable thirst that clawed at her insides. But then, just as she thought she could go no further, she heard a voice again. The man was speaking to her softly, soothingly, though the words were indistinguishable. She didn't know what he was saying, but the tone of his voice reached deep into her heart, breaking through the numbness and despair. His hands, once again, were gentle as he reached down to her, brushing the damp fur from her face. When the car finally stopped, the man rushed to open the door, and she was lifted once more. This time by someone else, a woman dressed in a white coat. The sterile smell of a veterinary clinic filled the air, overwhelming and sharp, but it was a sign that Kira was about to be given a chance. Inside the clinic, Kira was laid down on a cold examination table. Her body felt like a limp ragdoll, devoid of any strength or control. The cold steel under her was a stark contrast to the warmth of the man's arms, and her body trembled at the sudden change. The veterinarian, a middle-aged woman with a face marked by years of experience, knelt beside Kira. Her hands were swift and practiced as she began to assess the dog's condition, her expression darkening with every passing moment. "She's barely hanging on," the veterinarian muttered, her voice low but urgent. The man stood behind her, his hands gripping the edge of the counter, his face pale. He looked as if he might collapse at any moment, but there was no turning back now. Kira needed him, and she needed this woman, this stranger who would become her only hope. The vet's fingers gently prodded Kira's sides, checking for signs of life. Kira's body flinched at the touch, but there was no reaction, no movement, no sign of response. It was as if the world had already taken her away. The woman's face darkened further, but she didn't give up. Her hands moved to Kira's chest, and she pressed down gently, trying to get a pulse. The seconds stretched on, each one more excruciating than the last. And then, just as hope seemed to be slipping away once again, a faint quiver passed through Kira's ear. It was so subtle that only the woman noticed, but it was enough. The vet's eyes flicked up to the man, a spark of something. Was it hope? Shining in her gaze. "She's alive," the woman whispered, her voice trembling. Kira's heart, weak but still beating, responded to the woman's words. She wasn't alone anymore. She wasn't abandoned. A faint sense of hope began to grow inside her, though it was fragile, delicate. The man stepped forward, his eyes filled with both fear and something else. A determination, a willingness to fight for this dog who had suffered so much. He reached down to gently stroke her head, his touch shaking slightly, and Kira, with what little strength she had left, managed to lift her muzzle to nudge his hand. It was barely a movement, but it was enough. She was still there, still fighting. The veterinarian worked quickly, administering fluids and medications to help Kira regain her strength. Her voice became more reassuring now, but Kira could barely hear it. She was focused on the faint, unspoken promise in the man's eyes, the promise of a future, of a life beyond the pain and suffering. For the first time in what seemed like an eternity, Kira allowed herself to hope again. Kira's world was blurred, her senses still spinning as she lay on the cold examination table. Her body was a battleground of exhaustion, hunger, and pain, but there was a new, flickering feeling in her chest, something that had been missing for so long. It was hope. Hope that perhaps, just perhaps, she might make it through this nightmare. Her body felt like it had been torn apart and put back together, but the faint signs of life, the quiver in her ear, the small nudge of her muzzle, were all she needed to hang on. Hours passed, though Kira had no concept of time. The world around her seemed to stretch into infinity, the voices of the man and the veterinarian blending together, indistinguishable, a constant hum in the background. But it was comforting, that hum. It meant she was not alone anymore. It meant she was being cared for, something she hadn't known for what felt like an eternity. The man, though clearly exhausted, did not leave her side. He hovered by her, his hand occasionally brushing through her matted fur, offering quiet words of encouragement, even though he knew she couldn't understand them. His voice, though low and full of pain, had become a balm to her shattered spirit. It reminded her of the warmth she had once known in the arms of her former owner, before everything had gone horribly wrong. But as the hours bled into the night, Kira's condition remained fragile. The veterinarian worked tirelessly, giving Kira fluids, medication, and gentle care. There were moments when the dog's body responded faintly, and the man's face lit up with an unspoken joy, but these moments were few and far between. For every flicker of hope, there was a wave of doubt. The air in the clinic was heavy, thick with the weight of uncertainty. The scent of antiseptic hung in the air, blending with the softer, quieter smells of the animals around her. But Kira barely noticed. Her world had narrowed down to the soft pressure of the man's hand, the steady beeping of machines, and the feeling of warmth slowly returning to her body. In the early hours of the morning, when the sun had not yet begun to rise, Kira's chest heaved with the effort to take a breath. Her mouth opened slightly, dry and cracked from thirst, and her body trembled. The veterinarian, seeing this, moved quickly. She gently raised Kira's head, holding a small dish of water in front of her. At first, Kira only stared at it. Her dry, cracked tongue flicked out but hesitated. She could barely remember what it felt like to drink. Everything had become so distant, so surreal. But then the man leaned down, his voice low and steady, speaking softly as though urging her to take that first sip. "Come on, girl," he whispered. "Just one small drink. You can do it." Kira's eyes flickered, the faintest sign of recognition in their depths. She could feel his presence beside her, his unwavering dedication. She mustered the strength to lick at the water, her dry tongue scraping the side of the bowl. It was not much, just a few small laps, but it was enough to stir something deep inside her. A feeling she hadn't felt in days. A sense of relief, of restoration. The cool water soothed her cracked throat, and she took another sip, her body responding ever so slightly. The man smiled, his eyes bright with unshed tears, and for the first time since he had found her buried in the dirt, he allowed himself to feel a spark of hope. Kira was still with him, still fighting, still willing to try. He could feel the strength of her spirit, and it was like a lifeline pulling him back from the brink of despair. Over the next few days, the road to recovery was slow, agonizingly so. Kira was still very weak, barely able to lift her head or move her limbs. Her body was a skeleton of its former self, skin stretched thin over the bones, her ribs visible beneath her fur. Her fur, once sleek and strong, had become brittle, and the bones beneath it ached with every movement. But each day, there were signs that Kira was improving. The faintest twitch of her tail when the man came near, the small, almost imperceptible lift of her head as she heard his voice. Her recovery was not easy. The vet warned them both that there were no guarantees. Kira's body had been starved, dehydrated, and ravaged by the trauma, and it would take time for her to regain even a fraction of her strength. But Kira never stopped fighting. Every small victory, every small movement, felt like a triumph. One day, as the man sat by her side, he gently stroked her head, his fingers running through the patches of fur that were still tangled. He spoke to her softly, telling her about the world outside, about the green fields and the soft winds, about the promise of a life free from pain. Kira's eyes flickered at the sound of his voice, and she turned her head slightly toward him. "Just hold on, girl," he murmured. "You're going to get through this. I won't leave you." And in that moment, Kira felt something new, a flicker of warmth in her heart, something stronger than the pain, stronger than the fear. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe that it could be something good. She could feel her strength returning, little by little, and she would keep fighting as long as there was someone by her side. The man kept his promise. Every day he visited, bringing her food, water, and love. And every day Kira grew stronger. The road was long, but it was a road Kira was willing to walk, because she wasn't alone anymore. And as the days went on, as Kira's strength grew and the scars of her betrayal began to heal, there was something more that blossomed inside her. Trust. Trust in this man who had given her a second chance. Trust in the kindness of strangers. Trust that she would never have to suffer alone again. The road ahead was still uncertain, but the future was now a place filled with possibility. Weeks passed, and the change in Kira was remarkable. Her once sunken eyes began to regain their brightness, and the dry, cracked skin on her paws slowly softened. The scars of her betrayal, both physical and emotional, were still there, faint remnants of the past that would never be fully erased. But each day, she grew stronger, more vibrant, and more trusting of the world around her. The man who had rescued her was there every step of the way. He never left her side, sitting beside her when she rested, feeding her when she was able to eat, and offering her quiet words of reassurance whenever she looked at him with those searching eyes. He wasn't just a rescuer. He had become her anchor. His presence, his consistency, his patience. These things gave Kira a reason to hope again, a reason to fight. There were moments when Kira's recovery seemed too slow. Some days, she would lie still, staring at the walls of the small room she was kept in, the weight of her past bearing down on her. The memory of being buried alive, the suffocating pain, the searing heat of the sun, and the cold bite of rain still haunted her, slipping into her mind uninvited. But then, without fail, the man would come, and his voice, low and soothing, would bring her back from the edge of her fears. One day, as the first signs of spring began to stretch across the land, the man took Kira outside. He helped her into the garden, her legs still shaky but her spirit stronger than it had been before. The fresh air felt like a balm to her wounded soul, the warmth of the sun on her face a reminder that life, though difficult, was still worth living. Kira stood at the edge of the garden, her body quivering, and then, as if she had forgotten how to do it, she took her first hesitant step. The ground beneath her paws was soft, warm, and inviting. The grass swayed gently in the breeze, a patchwork of green and yellow that seemed to stretch on forever. Kira hesitated, unsure, but then she took another step, and then another. Her legs were wobbly at first, but she kept going, her tail beginning to sway slowly behind her, a sign that she was regaining confidence, even in the face of everything she had been through. The man, watching from a distance, smiled. He had always known that Kira had the strength within her to overcome the darkness that had claimed her life. It was that strength, that unwavering spirit, that had kept her alive when all hope seemed lost. And now, with each passing day, she was proving him right. As Kira explored the garden, sniffing at the flowers, her ears twitching at every sound, the man stood quietly, content in the knowledge that she had found a small piece of peace in the world again. She had not only survived the unimaginable but was now learning to live again. It wasn't a perfect journey. There were still scars, still moments when the darkness crept in, but it was a journey worth taking. Over time, the bond between Kira and the man deepened. They had become family in the truest sense of the word. There were still tough days, days when Kira's trauma resurfaced, when the fear in her eyes returned, but the man was there, always patient, always gentle, always ready to offer her love and security. The man's home became Kira's sanctuary, a place where she was no longer afraid. She no longer cowered when someone raised their hand, no longer flinched when a loud sound startled her. The world outside, once so terrifying, began to feel less like a danger and more like a space to be explored. Each time she took a step forward, it was a victory, not just for her but for the man as well. But Kira's healing was not just about her physical recovery. It was about reclaiming the trust that had been shattered, about learning to forgive, not just others but herself. Kira had to understand that what had happened to her wasn't her fault. She had been betrayed by the very one she trusted the most, but that betrayal didn't define her. She was more than the trauma she had endured. She was strong. She was resilient. She was alive. One day, when the warmth of the sun bathed the garden and the birds sang cheerfully in the trees, Kira took another significant step in her journey. The man was sitting in the yard, reading a book, and Kira, who had been resting nearby, walked over to him. She sat down beside him, her body now strong enough to stand at his side without shaking. The man looked up, his face breaking into a smile as he reached out to stroke her head. "You're my girl now," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You've come back from the darkest place, and you've shown me what true strength is." Kira looked up at him with those deep, soulful eyes, eyes that had seen too much pain, too much suffering, but now shone with a quiet peace. She nuzzled into his hand, and for the first time in a long while, she felt like she belonged. She had found a new home, a place where she was loved, where she was safe, and where the future no longer seemed so uncertain. The days grew longer, and Kira's steps became surer, her spirit lighter. She ran freely in the yard, her fur shimmering in the sunlight, her tail wagging with joy. There were no more dark nights of suffering, no more feeling of being abandoned. Kira had found her place in the world again, and it was a world filled with love and warmth. The man who had rescued her had not only saved her life, he had given her a second chance at happiness, at peace. And Kira, in turn, gave him something he could never have expected. A reminder of the power of hope, of resilience, and of the incredible bond that can exist between a dog and the person who chooses to love her. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the world, Kira lay down beside the man, her head resting on his lap, content. The journey had been long, and it had been hard, but it had led her here home, where she was safe, where she was loved, and where she would spend the rest of her days in peace. And so, Kira became more than just a survivor. She became a symbol of resilience, of the strength of spirit that no betrayal could ever break. She had found a second chance, and she would cherish it always. It had been months since Kira's rescue, and her transformation was nothing short of miraculous. No longer the broken dog who had been buried alive in a pit of despair, Kira was now a vibrant, loving companion, her spirit and heart healed by the unwavering kindness of the man who had saved her. The garden, once a place of fear and uncertainty, had become Kira's sanctuary. Every corner she explored was a reminder of how far she had come. The long, painful days of suffering were now memories, distant and fading, replaced by the warmth of sunlight, the sound of laughter, and the soothing presence of the man who had rescued her. Kira had grown strong, both physically and emotionally. Her coat had regained its luster, and her muscles had filled out, returning her to the proud, majestic form she had once known. Her eyes, once hollow and haunted, now sparkled with joy, and her tail, once stiff with fear, wagged freely and happily whenever the man approached. There was a new rhythm to their days. The man, who had poured all of his energy into her healing, was now able to witness the quiet joy that Kira had found in their shared life. He would take her on long walks through the countryside, their bond growing stronger with every step they took together. She would run ahead, her paws kicking up the earth in excitement, and when she turned to look at him, her eyes would meet his with a sense of gratitude and trust that took his breath away. Every morning, Kira would greet him with a soft whine, her tail wagging so fiercely that it seemed as though it might lift her off the ground. And when he returned home in the evening after a long day of work, she would be there at the door, waiting eagerly, her eyes full of excitement as if each reunion were the first time they had seen each other. It was a reminder of the bond they shared, a bond that had been forged in the fires of pain and healing. Kira's trust in people had been rebuilt, brick by brick, but there was one person who still held a special place in her heart, the man who had saved her. She followed him everywhere, her loyal gaze never straying far from his face, always seeking his reassurance. He had been the first to show her that humans could be kind, and in his presence, she had learned that love and safety could exist, even in a world that had once betrayed her. As time went on, Kira became more than just a pet to the man. She was his confidant, his companion, his best friend. She offered him something that he could not find elsewhere: unconditional love. In return, he gave her the life she had always deserved, a life free from fear, pain, and abandonment. One sunny afternoon, as they sat together in the garden, the man looked down at Kira, who was lying contentedly at his feet, her head resting on his knee. Her eyes were closed in peaceful contentment, and her breathing was slow and steady, the soft rise and fall of her chest a testament to the strength she had gained. "You've come so far," the man whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't think I could have asked for a better companion." Kira opened one eye, her tail flicking gently against the grass in response to his words. It was as if she understood. She had always been a silent observer, her loyalty to him unwavering. But now, with her head resting against his leg, she seemed to understand that they had both been on a journey. It wasn't just about her survival. It was about them finding each other. For a long time, Kira had believed that love was something to fear, that it was something that could be taken away in an instant, leaving nothing but emptiness. But now she knew, differently. Love, true love, was something that could heal even the deepest wounds. It was something that could overcome the most unbearable pain, and it was something that had the power to restore a broken soul to wholeness. The man, who had saved her from the brink of death, had shown her that. He had given her the strength to believe again, to trust, to live. And in return, Kira had given him her heart. She had become his protector, his friend, his family. Together, they had forged a new life, one filled with love, companionship, and the kind of bond that could never be broken. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink, the man and Kira sat side by side, watching the day slip away. The peacefulness that had settled over them was the culmination of months of hard work, love, and healing. They had both been broken, but they had also been rebuilt, stronger, more resilient, and more whole than ever before. Kira lifted her head and looked up at the man, her eyes full of gratitude. She didn't need to speak. Her heart, her spirit, her very being told him everything he needed to know. She was happy, she was safe, and she was loved. In that moment, the man knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. There was nothing that could break the bond they had created. No matter how dark the past had been, the future was bright. And with Kira by his side, he knew that anything was possible.